So, My Hero Academia Manga Chapter 317 has officially released in Shonen Jump, and let me just say that in this video, I want to go over the differences between the fan translations and the official translations, and go over the potential development and growth that Deku is going to go through from this chapter in the future chapters in the story. And without the way, let's get right into the intro. Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Man Drew, here to talk to you more about My Hero Academia, Chapter 317. And oh boy, there's a fair amount that we need to talk about in this chapter. Not necessarily with the actual differences between translations, we'll get to that, but mainly when it comes to Deku and what this chapter is showing Deku has become and what it shows that he could become in the future if he continues going down this path. And that is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. And before we get more into the chapter proper, when it comes to the discussions, I'd like to ask you, if you haven't done so, if you just stumbled across this video and you like this type of content, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I talk about My Hero Academia, do discussions, spoilers, as well as do actual reviews on the chapter. So if that's something that you're interested in, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Without the way, let's get right into the discussion proper. So to start off, let's talk about the major differences between the unofficial and the official translations. And overall, there isn't that many differences, and that could just be due to mistakes or just misinterpretations of the actual information provided. But overall, this chapter in both translations are pretty accurate to one another. The first difference that I really want to bring up happens at the beginning of the chapter, where we have all the pro heroes, pretty much how they got out of the situation. It's pretty much the same with both translations. They were just able to get out the explosion without that much harm. Some of them may have a little bit of burn on them, but yeah, they're talking about the situation, how they do not have any more information about the Paranormal Liberation Front, about All for One, because the mansion blew up, so there's no more evidence, and they're questioning whether or not they want to talk to Lady Nagin about it, which they unfortunately can't because of the situation that she's in. And the main difference that I want to bring up comes from what Mount Lady says and what Endeavor says at the beginning of this chapter. Mount Lady basically confirms that in the unofficial translations that they're going to be placing a heavier burden on Deku by him going out and trying to stop the other villains, while in the official translation it basically is confirming that Deku is going to be in charge of hunting down the League of Villains, which I guess you could equate the burden to be very similar, but the wording is slightly different. But something else that is different is when it comes to how they're basically explaining the police involvement and the other heroes' involvement, because in the unofficial, they're basically saying that they don't have a whole lot of information when it comes to the police helping them, and how they need a little bit more support from the other heroes before they become exhausted, as well as exhausting Deku and him helping them as well. That is what is basically stated in the unofficial translations. But in the official translations, they're basically saying the same thing about how they're lacking like cop and manpower. They don't have really anyone that has a count of the League of Villains, but they're specifically talking about whether or not they should be putting together a task force to basically like task force made of fellow heroes to help find and gather information about All for One. And I will say that that is some information that is brought up a little bit later, but is directly addressed by Mount Lady in the official and not necessarily by Mount Lady in the unofficial. And like a small little difference between the official and unofficial translations is basically the translations of Death Arms, because Death Arm in the unofficial translations is translated as Death Arms, while in the official translations, for some apparent reason, is translated as Desutgoro, which is basically sort of kind of Death Arm's Japanese Romanji name, or Romanjanized name. Sorry about that. But yeah, it's not that big of a difference. It's just weird they use that in the official instead of his actual name of Death Arms. So yeah, that's one difference. And the second major difference that comes between the official and unofficial translations basically comes in towards the conversation that Midoriya Deku is having with All Might, and the specific thing that I want to tackle is what he brings up when it comes to his control over 100%, because in the unofficial translation, he brings up the idea that he can move at 100% without sustaining any damage, just like All Might could. But in the official translations, he says that he's capable of being on par with 100% and that he's able to do it without any recoil. And that's a major difference, because one is implying that he is capable of going 100% of his power without breaking his body, which we've seen that that is not the case, while in the official translations it's showing that he's on par, which could be specifically tied to the fact that he's able to use Fajin with his 45% to be able to reach 100% equivalent, which would be 100% in All Might's time, but not be 100% of Deku. So that is a major difference, and it kind of like sways the idea that in the unofficial he has full mastery of 100%, while in a unofficial translation he actually has equivalent strength to 100%. So that's actually a major difference. And yeah, that's mainly the major differences between the unofficial and the official translations. And from here, I really want to go more into Deku's character and what we've seen of his character in this chapter and what it means moving forward. Because when it comes to what we see in Deku in this chapter, Deku is going down a very dark and dangerous path. In actuality, a path that he's going down that even All For One brought up last chapter, and about how he's going to be wearing down on Deku, and that if he continues down this path, it's going to wear down on him more and more, where eventually the light in his eye is going to disappear. And from what we see in this chapter, it's basically happening now. So for starters, I want to go over like why Deku's light is beginning to fade, because we do see both a physical and a metaphorical relationship to the actual light in his eyes disappearing, as seen a few times in this chapter, where we get focuses on Deku's eyes, where at the beginning of the chapter we see that Deku has this sullen face on, and that when it comes to that facial expression, we see that he doesn't really have like that same light that he had at the beginning of the story, that basically we're able to like see his eyes like extremely brightly, the outer edges of his eyes, even his pupils, and even the little glint in his eye. We were able to see that at the beginning of the story, and we even get a flashback to that moment where we see that glint in his eye. But throughout this chapter, in the present time, we always see his eyes, and if we see it up close, it's always slightly shaded in with like darknesses around the pupil beginning to encroach on it. And the further we get into the chapter, the more his eyes begin to go black, more darkness goes over his pupils, where the lights begin to fade, up until we get to the end of the chapter, where we get the full page spread of him, that one page spread, where people are basically questioning about whether or not he's actually a hero, where if we look at him, we don't see any of the darks of his eyes. And that isn't something that happens just once in this chapter. There are multiple panels in this chapter where we see some aspect of his eye where it's nothing but dark. And that really isn't that important, but what is probably the most important is that whenever we do see his eye, it's always slightly shaded with a shade of dark, showing that his like the glow in his eyes, the brightness in his eyes is beginning to fade the longer he's fighting against All For One in this state. Because something else that we also notice in this chapter, and it's something that I didn't notice on my first read, and it's that we always see the lightning going around him. We always see him in his full cowling, even when he's just having a normal conversation with All Might. And this is something very interesting, because it shows that he is fully focused on trying to stop All For One, in the same vein as how Endeavor was focused on trying to surpass All Might. And it shows that Deku is going down a very similar path as Endeavor, being so hyper focused on this one goal that it's probably going to wane not only on his physical body, his mental stress, but also on his relationships with other people, such as All Might, where we saw in this chapter where he's basically cutting ties with All Might, and this is the person that he looked up to most in the world. We're seeing Deku going down a very destructive road, and in actuality, this is something that isn't uncommon. We've seen Deku do very destructive things, not just to his body, but also to his mind, where he normally like wrecks his body to the point where he's barely able to move his fingers, barely able to move his arms. And even though he's not going through that same physical stress, he's now going through the mental stress, because we see that he's not eating, he's not sleeping, and as from the title of this chapter, he's covered in scars, blood and filth, meaning that he's not bathing, he's not taking care of himself, and the fact that he's doing this all on his own is showing a very similar destructive path that All Might was going on when he abandoned Night Eye. And by doing that, we see that potentially All Might is going to face a bad and gruesome death. And I think that it may be tied to Deku doing the same thing that All Might was doing in his youth, separating himself from other people and putting all of the burden on himself and doing it alone. And this idea mainly comes from the fact that if Deku continues down this same path, it could eventually lead to All Might's death, potentially either indirectly or directly by Deku's hands. And this kind of ties into a theory that I have that when All Might dies, then One For All will fully transfer over to Deku, but All Might's consciousness will not fully transfer over. And it will be very impactful if that theory were to come into fruition, if this was the last moment that Deku had with All Might before his death, his last conversation that he had before he left, which is basically him abandoning him, which is very impactful as we see a scene of both Deku and All Might trying with their hands only in the frame as All Might is trying to extend his hand to help Deku, but Deku is not allowing that, which is very ironic because Deku is trying to lend a hand to Shigaraki, but it would be very hypocritical of him to lend a hand to Shigaraki when he's not willing to take a hand himself. I think this is going to lead into a few different chapters and a few different arcs where Deku is going to face off against Shigaraki, and he would try to extend a hand to him, and Shigaraki would refuse. And the reasoning why Shigaraki would refuse is because he sees that Deku isn't like the type of person that would actually accept help himself. How Shigaraki may be working with his fellow teammates, his fellow League of Villain members to fight against Deku, but Deku will be on his own, and that Shigaraki would not accept this because Deku isn't following his own advice, asking for help. And if Deku isn't asking for help, how can he help someone else when he needs help himself? It's going to be a little bit more ironic in that situation, especially if that situation leads to All Might's death. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is that what we see in this chapter is going to probably be the arc that Deku is going to be going down. He's going to be going down a very dark road that is going to wear and tear at his soul, where he's eventually going to reach a point where the light is completely gone in his eyes, where he's not going to be able to ask anyone for help. How he's going to basically sort of kind of destroy his body to the point where he's unable to move on his own, where he would need help from someone else. And that could lead to potentially, if he does continue down this path, someone severely getting hurt, injured, or dying, and potentially that could be All Might, because as we see, All Might isn't going to stop following Deku. So potentially what I see from what's going on in this chapter is that there's going to be a moment where all of this anger, all of this rage, all of this solo actions, all of this destructive behavior is going to have a major consequence in All Might's death, and that is going to be one of the breaking points for Deku, for him to go down fully down this path. But he's eventually going to be brought back, not necessarily by Stain, who we see in this chapter, but going to be brought back by his friends. How he's going to realize that the situation that he's in, All Might's death, is going to be on his head. It's going to be his fault, but that he doesn't have to carry that burden on his own, because he has Bakugo, he has Shoto, he has Uraka, who are also there, who are also his friends, that are willing to help him when he needs it, and even if he doesn't ask for it, which will eventually begin an arc for him to come back to the light, where the light could potentially return back to his eyes, and at that moment, he will be willing and ready to save Shigaraki. So yeah, when it comes to this chapter, it really just shows how much Deku has grown, either for the better or for the worse, ever since we saw him at the beginning of the story. He was just this lonely kid who wanted to be a hero, just like All Might, and now he is sort of pseudo-hero, pseudo-vigilante that is only focused on stopping All For One, and it's leading to a very destructive behavior. So that's going to be very interesting in seeing how that's going to be going moving forward. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about this chapter right now. What did you think of the chapter? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? What did you like about the chapter? Do you think that Deku is going to go down this dark path, and do you think that it's going to lead to a major consequence potentially All Might's death. Leave your thoughts down in the comments down below. Leave a like on this video if you liked it. Hit that notification bell to be notified for whenever I upload. Subscribe to my YouTube channel at Manga Man Drew. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!